Wouldn't it be great if God actually showed us the whole process? He showed us exactly where we were going and how to get there. Rather than this whole just one step at a time thing. And it seems like it would be so much easier. But, well, first off, that would negate the element of trust. And part of our growing in our trust in Him is a critical piece of our relationship, as we'll see in a moment. But what if God showed us a big picture and we couldn't handle it? Welcome to God Powered. Now, this is a story we're looking at today that pretty much everybody knows, but there's some interesting caveats we don't pay attention to. And that's the story of the 12 spies going forward to check out what God had promised His people. But before we do that, I want to back up a step. And at the end, I think we'll see how this has relevance to so many of us today. And so before it was the 12 spies checking out the promised land, way before that, it was a place called Egypt. Now, we're going to see at the end the corollary for us today. But what was Egypt? Now, we look at Egypt today, knowing these stories, and we equate it to slavery, a bad place. But Egypt did not start out that way. Egypt, remember, God put His people there. In fact, Psalms 105 says God created the drought just to push them into Egypt. Why is that? See, prior to that, God's people was this group, this family of about 70 people that wandered from place to place. That was the first season of their life, their relationship with God. And they would wander from place to place. And they grew to 70 people, and God would watch over and protect them. But God wanted so much more for them. So He pushed them into Egypt. Now remember, before Egypt became bad, it was actually great. Goshen, for them, was the best part of Egypt, and He had pushed them there. Why? He wanted them to flourish. That season between when they went into Egypt as 70 people who were basically nomads, they grew to several million people. God put them there on purpose to grow and to flourish. But we know that God actually hardened Pharaoh's heart. He created the discomfort. Why? This wasn't permanent. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. So they leave Egypt. You know the story. We won't cover all of that today. But several things happened along the way. And what was happening? God was trying to train them to trust Him. And this is an important lesson for you and I. See, God does have so much more for you and I. And what happens? We have in the past lived in a honeymoon relationship with God. We were children. And what happened? God just took care of everything. But God is saying more and more, it's time for us to become men and women, sons and daughters of the living God. And part of that requires us both maturing and developing a deeper trust. And God was doing that with His people. He took them out of Egypt, and He was taking them to the promised land. Now, it wasn't just a land. God calls it their inheritance. God has an inheritance for you and me. And we're going to come back to that. But what happened along the way as He's trying to teach them to trust Him? We know Micah says, I was trying everything to teach you about my faithfulness. So God takes us in this relationship where we walk with Him step by step. He doesn't give step 2, He doesn't give us step 3, He doesn't give us step 4, but He literally gives us step by step because it's a trust relationship. But what if we could short circuit that and see the whole plan? And that's what happened with the 12 spies. Now, before we go there, one of the things we need to understand is that wasn't God's plan. We look at that story because God told Moses, send out the 12 spies. But when we move forward, now that's in Numbers chapter 13. You can look it up for yourself. But in Deuteronomy chapter 1, this is later. And this is Moses preparing that next generation to receive all that God has for them because the other generation couldn't handle it. And what does He say? He tells them the plan was they got to the point, and Moses said, okay, God is saying the land lies before you. go and take possession just as God said. Now, taking possession, as we will see in a moment, was going to require a huge degree of trust. And right out of the gate, they're struggling because they didn't. What did they do? So it was not God's plan to send the 12 spies out, but rather it was theirs. They went to Moses and they had all their excuses. Oh, well, if we send spies, they can find the best routes and what cities we should attack. But what were they doing? They were looking for reassurance. And so they asked for the spies. Moses petitions God, and God says, okay. Now, one of the things to understand is these 12 spies were not just anybody. They were leaders from each one of the tribes. They go, they spy out the land. Now, I've always found this fascinating. Some of you have heard me say this before, but they go and they see all the blessings in the inheritance God has for them, and they bring evidence back. They bring back fruit from the land. One is a cluster of grapes that was so big, 2 men had to carry it on a pole. So there was evidence of God's abundant blessing there. But they return and they bring this evidence and they talk about how amazing it is. The inheritance God has for you and I is unimaginably good. It is, and here's what's interesting. God is so big and magnificent, the inheritance for you is radically different than what it is for me because God does everything individually. And He has got something for you that is unbelievable. But as we'll see, we have to grow, again, in that maturity and that trust to be able to receive, to handle, well, to receive it in the first place, and then the maturity to handle the authority that goes with it. So the 12 spies go, and they bring back not just stories of how great it is, they bring back evidence. But then 10 of the spies start talking about the challenges, how difficult it's going to be. Now, remember, everything they said was absolutely true. It wasn't that they were misleading anybody. Everything those 10 spies said was absolutely true. They talked about the challenges. Every nation there was stronger than God's people. Every single one. There was no easy battles on the horizon. And in fact, we know the story of David and Goliath. The Anakim, the giants were there. And they go on and they actually say, we were like grasshoppers in their sight. And I'm sure they thought the same of us. So the challenges they are bringing back to the people are absolutely genuine. But what they neglected, see, they were looking strictly in their natural lives. Yeah, there's amazing blessings, but I don't know how we overcome these challenges. How do we do this? How can we handle this? Now, too, Joshua and Caleb, they were able to look beyond the challenges. Their trust in the living God was deep enough that they did not ignore the challenges. They didn't have a plan from God on how He was going to deal with the challenges, but they literally said, our God is well able. And so the difference was not in not seeing the challenges, but who had the faith, who had the trust to say, I don't know. I don't know how God's going to give us the victory, but He said He's giving it to us. Now, as you know, what happened? They discouraged all the people. And the people cried all night. And then they actually started talking about, let's elect a leader to take us back to Egypt. Now, because of that, you know the story, they missed out. And not only did they miss out, they delayed everyone else from getting it. God said, you spied out the land for 40 days, so there'll be a year for every day. That's the penalty for not being able to go in. So not only did they not get to go in, but they also delayed their families, their children, from receiving all that God had for them. Why? Because they saw the challenge. And remember, that was not God's plan. God's plan was to take them step by step into the promised land, where they would continue to trust Him And he would give them victory over each challenge, each battle that came their way. In doing so, he would be glorified and they would receive the blessing that he had for them. That was the plan the whole time. But they demanded to see the big picture. And the big picture scared them. Now, coming back to Egypt. Well, obviously at that point, Egypt represents slavery. But you know what happens? When we look at the challenge and we just don't see how it's going to work, how often do we cling to the past? Even though the past is dead to us now, we can't go backwards. More importantly, what about those who still are nostalgic about the good days in Egypt, that prior to slavery, how good it was back then? You know, we have come out of a honeymoon stage with God. And it has become more challenging as God is making more and more of his people uncomfortable. Why? Because he wants us to leave behind Egypt. He wants us to leave behind the past, which he put us there for a purpose, but it's a new season. He's raising sons and daughters, new generation heroes of the faith. And for us to be and do and accomplish all that he has for us, it requires us, again, to have a unbelievably deep maturity, a level of responsibility to handle all he's going to give us. But more importantly, he's calling you and I to a deeper level of trust than we've ever been to before. It's the only way that his power is released, that the victory comes, and that he is glorified. So we do walk step by step, trusting him. But on a side note, as I wrap up, I want to challenge you. What are the dreams? What are the things that God has put in your heart? I want to challenge you to believe in them, for them. Not because you can accomplish it or I can, but because he can. And if you don't know what those dreams are, God was faithful to tell them repeatedly he had a promised land for them, a land of milk and honey. Now, they didn't know what it looked like, but he was faithful to assure them he had something amazing for them. God has something amazing for you and for me. And it's unique. He is so big and majestic. He doesn't do cookie cutter. If you don't have in your heart that glimmer, that desire that you think is from God, can I challenge you right now? Ask God, ask the Holy Spirit to just open that up. Plant that seed in your heart, that desire that's from him, and let him begin to grow it. Let that vision in your life grow. As we trust him, we learn to trust him at a deeper and deeper level, that we might, yes, receive all that he has for us, but more importantly, that he would be glorified.